Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Raven's Readings. I'm reading from Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town by the Canadian humorist Stephen Leacock. He wrote this in 1912 as an imaginative and ironic portrayal of Mariposa. That's a fictional small town in Canada, modeled after Orillia, Ontario, where he spent many summers. I do readings twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. If you subscribe to my Substack newsletter, you'll get notified of my updates as soon as they're ready. If you enjoy this reading or have other classics you'd like to hear, leave me a comment. For my next novel, I might do The Maltese Falcon, written by Dashiell Hammett in 1930. The style is a lot like that of the 1941 film of the same name, starring Humphrey Bogart. Last time, we learned of an upcoming election in Mariposa. Bagshaw as the incumbent Liberal and Mr. Smith, the hotel proprietor, he will be running as a Conservative on a platform of temperance. Let's see how that rolls out. Chapter 11. The Candidacy of Mr. Smith. "Boys," said Mr. Smith to the two hostlers stepping out on the sidewalk in front of the hotel, "hoist that there British Jack over the place and hoist her up good." Then he stood and watched the flag fluttering in the wind. "Billy," he said to the desk clerk, "I'll get a couple more and put 'em up on the roof of the cafe behind the hotel. Wire down to the city and get a quotation on 100 of them. I take them signs, American drinks, out of the bar and put up new ones with British beer at all hours. Clear out the rye whiskey and order in Scotch and Irish. Then go up to the printing office and get me some placards." Then another thought struck Mr. Smith. "Say, Billy," he said, "wire to the city for 50 pictures of King George. Get 'em good and get 'em colored. Don't matter what they cost." "All right, sir," said Billy. "And Billy," called Mr. Smith, still another thought struck him. Indeed, the moment Mr. Smith went into politics, you could see these thoughts strike him like waves. "Get 50 pictures of his father, old King Albert." "All right, sir." "And say, I tell you, while you're at it, get some of the old Queen Victoria if you can. Get them in mourning with a harp and one of them lions and a 3-pointed prong." It was on the morning after the Conservative convention. Josh Smith had been chosen the candidate, and now the whole town was covered with flags and placards, and there were bands in the streets every evening, and noise and music and excitement that went on from morning till night. Election times are exciting enough even in the city, but there the excitement dies down in business hours. In Mariposa, there aren't any business hours, and the excitement goes on all the time. Mr. Smith had carried the convention before him. There'd been a feeble attempt to put up Nivens, but everybody knew that he was a lawyer and a college man and wouldn't have a chance by a man with a broader outlook like Josh Smith. So the result was that Smith was the candidate, and there were placards out all over the town with Smith and British allegiance in big letters, and people were wearing badges with Mr. Smith's face on one side and King George's on the other. And the fruit store next to the hotel had been cleaned out and turned into committee rooms with a gang of workers smoking cigars in it all day and half the night. There were other placards, too, with Bagshaw and Liberty and Bagshaw and Prosperity and Vote for the Old Missinaba Standard Bearer, and uptown beside the Mariposa house there were the Bagshaw committee rooms with a huge white streamer across the street and with a gang of Bagshaw workers smoking their heads off. But Mr. Smith had an estimate made which showed that nearly 2 cigars to 1 were smoked in his committee rooms, as compared with the Liberals. It was the first time in 5 elections that the Conservatives had been able to make such a showing as that. One might mention, too, that there were drone placards out, 5 or 6 of them, little things about the size of a pocket handkerchief with a statement that Mr. Edward Drone solicits the vote of the electors of Missinaba County, but you would never notice them. And when Drone tried to put up a streamer across the main street with Drone and Honesty, the wind carried it away into the lake. The fight was really between Smith and Bagshaw, and everybody knew it from the start. I wish I were able to narrate all the phases and the turns of the great contest from the opening of the campaign till the final polling day, but it would take volumes. First of all, of course, the trade question was hotly discussed in the 2 newspapers of Mariposa. The news packet and the Times Herald literally bristled with statistics. Then came interviews with the candidates and the expression of their convictions in regard to tariff questions. "Mr. Smith," said the reporter of the Mariposa news packet, "we'd like to get your views of the effect of the proposed reduction of the differential duties." "By gosh, Pete," said Mr. Smith, "you can search me. I have a cigar." "What do you think, Mr. Smith, would be the result of lowering the ad valorem British preference and admitting American goods at a reciprocal rate?" "It's a corker, ain't it?" asked Mr. Smith. "What'll you take, lager or domestic?" And in that short dialogue, Mr. Smith showed that he had instantaneously grasped the whole method of dealing with the press. The interview on the next day said that Mr. Smith, while unwilling to state positively that the principle of tariff discrimination was at variance with sound fiscal science, was firmly of opinion that any reciprocal interchange of tariff preferences with the United States must inevitably lead to a serious per capita reduction of the national industry. "Mr. Smith," said the chairman of a delegation of the manufacturers of Mariposa, "what do you propose to do in regard to the tariff if you're elected?" "Boys," answered Mr. Smith, "I'll put her up so darn high they won't ever get her down again." "Mr. Smith," said the chairman of another delegation, "I'm an old free trader." "Put her there," said Mr. Smith. "So am I. There ain't nothing like it." "What do you think about imperial defense?" asked another questioner. "Which?" asked Mr. Smith. "Imperial defense. Of what?" "Of everything." "Who says it?" said Mr. Smith. "Everybody's talking about it." "What do the conservative boys at Ottawa think about it?" answered Mr. Smith. "Oh, they're all for it." "Well, I'm for it too," said Mr. Smith. These little conversations represented only the first stage, the argumentative stage of the great contest. It was during this period, for example, that the Mariposa news packet absolutely proved that the price of hogs in Mariposa was 0.6 higher than the price of oranges in Southern California, and that the average decennial import of eggs into Missinaba County had increased 4.682 in the last 15 years more than the import of lemons in New Orleans. Figures of this kind made people think, most certainly. After all this came the organizing stage, and after that the big public meetings and the rallies, and perhaps you've never seen a county being organized. It's a wonderful sight. First of all, the Bagshaw men drove through it crosswise in top buggies and then drove through it again lengthwise. Whenever they met a farmer, they went in and ate a meal with him, and after the meal they took him out to the buggy and gave him a drink, and after that the man's vote was absolutely solid, until it was tampered with by feeding a conservative. In fact, the only way to show a farmer that you were in earnest is to go in and have a meal with him. If you won't eat it, he won't vote for you. That is the recognized political test. But of course, just as soon as the Bagshaw men had begun to get the farming vote solidified, the Smith buggies came driving through in the other direction, eating meals and distributing cigars and turning all the farmers back into conservatives. Here and there you might see Edward Drone, the independent candidate, wandering round from farm to farm in the dust of the political buggies. To each of the farmers he explained that he pledged himself to give no bribes, to spend no money, and to offer no jobs, and each one of them gripped him warmly by the hand and showed him the way to the next farm. After the organization of the county, there came the period of the public meetings and the rallies and the joint debates between the candidates and their supporters. I suppose there was no place in the whole Dominion where the trade question, the reciprocity question, was threshed out quite so thoroughly and quite such a national patriotic spirit as in Mariposa. For a month at least, people talked of nothing else. A man would stop another in the street and tell him that he'd read last night that the average price of an egg in New York was 0.01 more than the price of an egg in Mariposa, and the other man would stop the first one later in the day and tell him that the average price of a hog in Idaho was 0.6 of a cent per pound less, or more, he couldn't remember which for the moment, than the average price of beef in Mariposa. People lived on figures of this sort, and the man who could remember most of them stood out as a born leader. But of course, it was at the public meetings that these things were most fully discussed. It would take volumes to do full justice to all the meetings that they held in Missinaba County. But here and there, single speeches stood out as masterpieces of convincing oratory. Take, for example, the speech of John Henry Bagshaw at the Tecumseh Corner Schoolhouse. The Mariposa Times-Herald said next day that that speech would go down in history, and so it will, ever so far down. Anyone who has heard Bagshaw knows what an impressive speaker he is, and on this night when he spoke with the quiet dignity of a man old in years and anxious only to serve his country, he almost surpassed himself. Near the end of his speech, somebody dropped a pin, and the noise it made in falling fairly rattled the windows. "I'm an old man now, gentlemen," Bagshaw said, "and the time must soon come when I must not only leave politics, but must take my way towards that goal from which no traveller returns." There was a deep hush when Bagshaw said this. It was understood to imply that he thought of going to the United States. "Yes, gentlemen, I am an old man, and I wish, when my time comes to go, to depart, leaving as little animosity behind me as possible. But before I do go, I want it pretty clearly understand that there are more darned scoundrels in the Conservative Party than ought to be tolerated in any decent community. I bear," he continued, "malice towards none, and I wish to speak with gentleness to all. But what I will say is that how any set of rational, responsible men could nominate such a skunk as a Conservative candidate passes the bounds of my comprehension. Gentlemen, in the present campaign, there's no room for vindictive abuse. Let us rise to a higher level than that. They tell me that my opponent Smith is a common saloon keeper. Let it pass. They tell me that he has stood convicted of horse stealing, that he's a notable perjurer, that he's known as the blackest-hearted liar in Missinaba County. Well, let us not speak of it. Let no whisper of it pass our lips. No, gentlemen," continued Bagshaw, pausing to take a drink of water, "let us rather consider this question on the high plane of national welfare. Let us not think of our own particular interests, but let us consider the good of the country as a whole. And to do this, let me present to you some facts in regard to the price of barley in Tecumseh Township." Then, amid a deep stillness, Bagshaw read off the list of prices of 16 kinds of grain in 16 different places during 16 years. "But let me turn," Bagshaw went on, "to another phase of the national subject, and view for a moment the price of marsh hay in Missinaba County." When Bagshaw sat down that night, it was felt that a Liberal vote in Tecumseh Township was a foregone conclusion. But here they hadn't reckoned on the political genius of Mr. Smith. When he heard next day of the meeting, he summoned some of his leading speakers to him and said, "Boys, they're beating us on them statistics. Ours ain't good enough." He turned to Nivens and he said, "What was them figures you had the other night?" Nivens took out a paper and began reading. "Stop," said Mr. Smith. "What was that figure for bacon?" $14 million, said Nivens. "Not enough," said Mr. Smith. "Make it 20. They'll stand for it, them farmers." Nivens changed it. "And what was that for hay?" $2 a ton. "Shove it up to 4, said Mr. Smith. "And I tell you," he added, "if any of them farmers says the figures ain't correct, tell them to go to Washington and see for themselves. And say that if any man wants the proof of your figures, let him go over to England and ask. Tell him to go straight to London and see it all for himself in the books." Well, after this, there was no more trouble over statistics. I must say, though, that it is a wonderfully convincing thing to hear trade figures of this kind properly handled. Perhaps the best man on this kind of thing in the campaign was Mullins the banker. A man of his profession simply has to have figures of trade and population and money at his fingers' ends, and the effect of it in public speaking is wonderful. No doubt you have listened to speakers of this kind, but I question whether you have ever heard anything more typical of this sort of effect that I allude to than Mullins' speech at the big rally at the 4th concession. Mullins himself, of course, knows the figures so well that he never bothers to write them into notes, and the effect is very striking. "Now, gentlemen," he said very earnestly, How many of you know just to what extent the exports of this country have increased in the last 10 years? How many could tell what percent of increase there has been in 1 decade of our national importation? Then Mullins paused and looked around. Not a man knew it. I don't recall, he said, exactly the precise amount myself, not at this moment, but it must be simply tremendous. Or take the question of population, Mullins went on, warming up again as a born statistician always does at the proximity of figures. How many of you can state what has been the decennial percentage increase in our leading cities? There he paused, and would you believe it? Not a man could state it. I don't recall the exact figures, said Mullins, but I have them at home, and they are positively colossal. But just in one phase of the public speaking, the candidacy of Mr. Smith received a serious setback. It had been arranged that Mr. Smith should run on a platform of total prohibition. But they soon found out that it was a mistake. They had imported a special speaker from the city, a grave man with a white tie, who put his whole heart into the work and would take nothing for it, well, except his expenses and a sum of money for each speech, but beyond the money, I say, he would take nothing. He spoke one night at the Tecumseh Corners Social Hall at the same time when the Liberal meeting was going on at the Tecumseh Corners Schoolhouse. Gentlemen, he said as he paused halfway in his speech, while we're gathered here in earnest discussion, do you know what's happening over at the meeting place of our opponents? Do you know that 17 bottles of rye whiskey were sent out from this town this afternoon to that innocent and unsuspecting schoolhouse? 17 bottles of whiskey hidden in between the blackboard and the wall, and every single man that attends that meeting, mark my words, every single man, will drink his fill of the abominable stuff at the expense of the Liberal candidate. Just as soon as the speaker said this, you could see the Smith men at the meeting look to one another in injured surprise, and before the speech was over, half the hall was practically emptied. After that, the total prohibition plank was changed, and the committee substituted a declaration in favor of such a form of restricted license as should promote temperance while encouraging the manufacture of spirituous liquors, and by a severe regulation of the liquor traffic should place intoxicants only in the hands of those fitting to use them. Finally, there came the great day itself, the election day that brought, as everybody knows, the crowning triumph of Mr. Smith's career. There's no need to speak of it at any length because it has become a matter of history. In any case, everybody who has ever seen Mariposa knows just what election day is like. The shops, of course, are, as a matter of custom, all closed, and the bar rooms are all closed by law, so you have to go in by the back way, and all the people are in their best clothes, and at first they walk up and down the street in a solemn way, just as they do on the 12th of July and on St. Patrick's Day before the fun begins. Everybody keeps looking in at the different polling places to see if anybody else has voted yet, because of course nobody cares to vote first for fear of being fooled after all and voting on the wrong side. Most of all did the supporters of Mr. Smith, acting under his instructions, hanging back from the poll in the early hours. To Mr. Smith's mind, voting was to be conducted on the same plan as bear shooting. Hold back your votes, boys, he said, and don't be too eager. Wait till she begins to warm up, and then let them have it good and hard. In each of the polling places in Mariposa, there's a returning officer, and with him are 2 scrutineers, and the electors, I say, peep in and out like mice looking into a trap. But if once the scrutineers get a man well into the polling booth, they push him in behind a little curtain and make him vote. The voting, of course, is by secret ballot, so that no one except the scrutineers and the returning office and the 2 or 3 people who may be round the poll can possibly tell how a man has voted. That's how it comes about that the first results are often so contradictory and conflicting. Sometimes the poll is badly arranged and the scrutineers are unable to see properly just how the ballots are being marked. They count up the Liberals and Conservatives in different ways. Often, too, a voter makes his mark so hurriedly and carelessly that they have to pick it out of the ballot box and look at it to see what it is. I suppose that may be why it was that in Mariposa the results came out at first in such a conflicting way. Perhaps that was how it was that the first report showed that Edward Drone, the independent candidate, was certain to win, You should have seen how the excitement grew up on the streets when the news was circulated. In the big rallies and meetings of the Liberals and Conservatives, everybody had pretty well forgotten all about Drone. And when the news got round at about 4 o'clock that the Drone vote was carrying the poll, the people were simply astounded. Not that they were not pleased. On the contrary, they were delighted. Everybody came up to Drone and shook hands and congratulated him and told him they had known all along that's what the country wanted, was a straight, honest, and non-partisan representation. The Conservatives said openly that they were sick of party, utterly done with it, and the Liberals said that they'd hated it. Already 3 or 4 of them had taken Drone aside and explained that what was needed in the town was a straight, clean, non-partisan post office, built on a piece of ground of a strictly non-partisan character, and constructed under contracts that were not tainted and smirched with party affiliation. 2 or 3 men were willing to show to Drone just where a piece of ground of this character could be bought. They told him, too, that in the matter of the postmastership itself, they had nothing against Trelawney, the present postmaster, in any personal sense, and would say nothing against him except merely that he was utterly and hopelessly unfit for his job, and that if Drone believed, as he said he did, in a purified civil servant, he ought to begin by purifying Trelawney. Already Edward Drone was beginning to feel something of what it meant to hold office, and there was creeping into his manner the quiet self-importance which is the first sign of conscious power. In fact, in that brief half-hour of office, Drone had a chance to see something of what it meant. Henry McGuinness came to him and asked straight out for a job as federal census taker on the ground that he was hard up and had been crippled with rheumatism all winter. Nelson Williamson asked for the post of wharf master on the plea that he'd been laid up with sciatic all winter and was absolutely fit for nothing. Erasmus Archer asked him if he could get his boy Pete into one of the departments at Ottawa, and made a strong case of it by explaining that he had tried at cussedness to get Pete a job anywhere else, and simply impossible. Not that Pete wasn't a willing boy, but he was slow, even his father admitted it, slow as the devil, blast him, and with no head for figures, and unfortunately he'd never had the schooling to bring him on. But if Drone could get him in at Ottawa, his father truly believed it would be the very place for him. Surely in the Indian Department or the Astronomical Branch or in the new Canadian Navy, there must be any amount of opening for a boy like this. And to all of these requests, Drone found himself explaining that he would take the matter under his very earnest consideration, and they must remember that he had to consult his colleagues and not merely follow the dictates of his own wishes. In fact, if he had ever in his life had any envy of cabinet ministers, he lost it in this hour. But Drone's hour was short. Even before the poll had closed in Mariposa, the news came sweeping in, true or false, that Bagshaw was carrying the county. The second concession had gone for Bagshaw in a regular landslide, 6 votes to only 2 for Smith, and all down the township line road, where the hay farms are, Bagshaw was said to be carrying all before him. Just as soon as that news went round the town, they launched the Mariposa band of the Knights of Pythias, every man in it is a Liberal, down the main street with big red banners in front of it with the motto, Bagshaw Forever, and in letters a foot high. Such rejoicing and enthusiasm began to set in as you never saw. Everybody crowded around Bagshaw on the steps of the Mariposa house and shook his hand and said they're proud to see the day and that the Liberal Party was the glory of the Dominion, and that as for this idea of nonpartisan politics, well, the very thought of it made them sick. Right away in the committee rooms, they began to organize the demonstration for the evening with lantern slides and speeches, and they arranged for a huge bouquet to be presented to Bagshaw on the platform by 4 little girls, all Liberals, all dressed in white. And it was just at this juncture, with 1 hour of voting left, that Mr. Smith emerged from his committee rooms and turned his voters on the town, much as the Duke of Wellington sent the whole line to the charge at Waterloo. From every committee room and subcommittee room, they poured out in flocks with blue badges fluttering on their coats. "Get at it, boys," said Mr. Smith. "Vote and keep on voting till they make you quit." Then he turned to his campaign assistant. "Billy," he said, Wire down to the city that I'm elected by an overwhelming majority and tell them to wire it right back. Send word by telephone to all the polling places in the county that the whole town has gone solid conservative and tell them to send the same news back here. Get carpenters and tell them to run up a platform in front of the hotel and tell them to take the bar door clean off its hinges and be all ready the minute the poll quits. Well, it was that last hour that did it. Just as soon as the big posters went up in the windows of the Mariposa news packet with the telegraphic dispatch that Josh Smith was reported to the city to be reelected and was followed by the messages from all over the county, the voters hesitated no longer. They had waited, most of them, all through the day, not wanting to make any error in their vote, but when they saw the Smith men crowding into the polls and heard the news from the outside, they went solid in one great stampede. By the time the poll was declared closed at 5 o'clock, there was no shadow of doubt that the county was saved and Josh Smith was elected for Missinaba. I wish you could have witnessed the scene in Mariposa that evening. It would have done your heart good. Such joy, such public rejoicing as you never saw. It turned out there really wasn't a liberal in the whole town. There never had been. They were all conservatives and had been for years and years. Men who had voted with pain and sorrow in their hearts for the Liberal Party for 20 years came out that evening and owned up straight they were conservatives. They said they could stand the strain no longer, simply had to confess. Whatever the sacrifice might mean, they were prepared to make it. Even Mr. Golgotha Gingham, the undertaker, came out and admitted that in working for John Henry Bagshaw, he'd been going straight against his conscience. He said that right from the first he'd had his misgivings. He said it haunted him. Often at night when he would be working away quietly, one of these sudden misgivings would overcome him so he could hardly go on with his embalming. Why, it appeared that on the very first day when reciprocity was proposed, he had come home and said to Mrs. Gingham that he thought it simply meant selling out the country. The strange thing was that ever so many others had just the same misgivings. Trelawney admitted that he'd said to Mrs. Trelawney that it was madness, and Jeff Thorpe, the barber, had said he admitted gone home to his dinner the first day reciprocity was talked about and said to Mrs. Thorpe that it would simply kill business in the country and introduce a cheap, shoddy American form of haircut that would render true loyalty impossible. To think that Mrs. Gingham and Mrs. Trelawney and Mrs. Thorpe had known all this for 6 months and kept quiet about it. And yet I think there were a good many Mrs. Ginghams in the country. It's merely another proof that no woman is fit for politics. The demonstration that night in Mariposa will never be forgotten. The excitement in the streets, the torchlights, the music of the band of the Knights of Pythias, an organization which is conservative in all but name, and above all, the speeches and the patriotism. They had put up a big platform in front of the hotel, and on it were Mr. Smith and his chief workers, and behind them a perfect forest of flags. They presented a huge bouquet of flowers to Mr. Smith, handed to him by 4 little girls in white, the same 4 I'd spoke above, but it turned out they were all conservatives. Then there were the speeches. Judge Pepperley spoke and said that there was no need to dwell on the victory that they had achieved because it was history. There was no occasion to speak of what part he himself had played within the limits of his official position, because what he had done was henceforth a matter of history. Nivens the lawyer said that he would only say just a few words, because anything that he might have done was now history. Later generations, he said, might read it, but it was not for him to speak of it, because it now belonged to the history of the country. And after them, others spoke in the same strain, and all refused absolutely to dwell on the subject, well, for more than half an hour, on the ground that anything that he might have done was better left for future generations to investigate. And no doubt this is very true as to some things, anyway. Mr. Smith, of course, said nothing. He didn't have to, not for 4 years, and he knew it. End of chapter. Great strategy by Smith to help everyone realize that they'd always all wanted just to vote for him, and on an adjusted sort of temperance platform. If you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll get notified of my updates as soon as they're ready. If you enjoy this reading or have other classics you'd like to hear, leave me a comment. Check out my other posts on my Substack at ravenshue.substack.com, and remember to share this with your friends. Ta-ta for now.